This is Parliament Hill tonight. Quiet now. After a busy day, the Liberal government revealed how it plans to spend your money, from women to Indigenous communities to families and more. But a big focus of the budget is right in there, the House of Commons, where the Liberals want to keep their majority in next year's election. Tonight, we're here to break down what the budget means for them and for you. I'm Rosemary Barton. This is The National. Tonight, we've got you covered on the budget.
Will changes to parental leave level the playing field for women, and how do they stack up against other countries?
The Liberals are talking about pharmacare again, but will Canada ever see universal drug coverage?
And of course, at issue is here, but let's start with the big picture. Billions of dollars in new spending that take the country deeper into the red. Here are the headlines. Gender equality, no surprise with this self-proclaimed feminist government. New measures aimed at more women in the workforce and closing that gender gap, including more than $1 billion towards parental leave, community women's organizations, and promoting pay equity. They're also trying to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So money has been set aside to tackle long-standing problems: access to health care, child welfare, housing, and clean drinking water. And there's a big investment in science, research, and innovation. The government investing billions with the hope it will further stimulate the economy. But this budget isn't just about fulfilling promises made in the last election, it's also about winning the next one. David Cochrane now on how the government is spending and why.
Budget 2018 is also a plan that respects the choice that Canadians made just a little over 2 years ago.
And the choice Canadians will make next year. So Bill Morneau is building a fiscal firewall on his left flank.
We know that diversity in the workforce boosts productivity and profitability.
The heavy focus on boosting opportunity for women is a pitch to the women voters who already heavily support the Liberals, but could be wooed by the NDP. Then there's the launch of a National Pharmacare Advisory Committee.
To study, evaluate, and ultimately recommend options on a path forward on pharmacare that puts Canadians first.
A signature NDP promise now potentially on track to be implemented by the Liberals.
This is a fantasy. We don't see even a single dollar of investment in a plan to implement pharmacare.
It all stacks on top of billions of already announced infrastructure spending and billions more for innovation or scientific research at universities. The bulk of it poured into urban centres which skew Liberal or switch with the NDP. It all seems laser-focused on consolidating the Trudeau coalition that delivered that 2015 majority.
But here's the sad reality after 3 years of Justin Trudeau. Never has a politician boasted so loudly and spent so much to achieve so little.
This budget adds nearly $100 billion to the debt. The deficit reduces over time, but there's no plan to balance the books, just to keep spending right to the end of a potential second term in office.
Unemployment rates are near the lowest that we've seen them in 40 years. Mr. Speaker, our plan is working because Canadians are working.
That's the political calculation here, that Canadians are more worried about their jobs and their bank accounts than what's in the government's.
Okay, so that's sort of the domestic politics. Yeah. One of the things that didn't get mentioned at all, I don't think you found his name, Donald Trump, and nothing around that.
No, he's everywhere except in this budget, right? Because the government going into this was under a lot of pressure to match the deep tax cuts that Donald Trump got passed right before Christmas. That argument coming from business leaders, from Perrin Beatty to John Manley, that this made Canada less competitive, and with the NAFTA uncertainty, there's all this extra incentive for businesses to put their money on the U.S. side of the border. So there was pressure here for Morneau to respond. He didn't. He says Canada is still studying in the U.S. tax cuts, which aren't fully done yet. The regulations are still being written, and he says they don't want to make an impulsive decision. And let's face it, it's not uncommon for business leaders, Rosie, to go looking for tax cuts. So expect some criticism on this action, especially from the Conservatives. But it's a fight that the Liberals tell me tonight they're prepared to have. If the Conservatives push them too hard on not matching the U.S. tax cuts, they'll say, well, that means bigger deficits. You already don't like the deficits we have. Sure. Or it means cutting programs, taking money away from Indigenous Canadians, single parents or parents. Now, that may be a bit simplistic, but that's how politics is sometimes.
Okay. David Cochran, thanks for your coverage today. As we've been saying, this budget really focused on closing the gender gap. In fact, of 367 pages, I've read almost everyone, no, not yet, nearly everyone had some mention of women, feminism, gender, or equality. And one new measure that could have a really big impact for families. And Adrian, that's what you're digging into tonight.
You bet, Rosie. That's the changes to parental leave that the government argues could get more women back into the workforce. Let's look at what's changing. So currently, parents can split 35 weeks of EI benefits at 55% of their paycheck. They can also spread it out and accept lower pay over a longer period. But really, any way you slice it, usually it's just mom taking that leave. Now there's a new use it or lose it extra 5 weeks for the parent who didn't give birth to share the work of caring for a new child. Was this an unusual move? Well, that depends what part of the globe you're looking at. Broadly, 95 countries have some sort of paid leave available for the non-birth parent, if you will. 29 countries currently have what they call a designated separate paternity leave, but the amount of money and the amount of time varies widely. There is one important example right here at home, Quebec. It started giving 5 weeks of leave for the second parent in 2005. Since then, new fathers in Quebec claiming paternal benefits soared from less than 30% to 80%. In the rest of Canada, it's more like 12%.
Hello. Oh, not so far back.
The data suggests, quite simply, the more parents share, the better it is for women.
When fathers take paternity leave, a couple of things happen. One, women don't feel as isolated, that they're bearing the whole burden of providing care in that first year. Second, they tend to return to the paid labor force sooner.
1, 2, 3.
Quebec dad Jean-François Bassette took the leave with each of his 4 kids.
I got to spend time with my daughter. My wife got to change careers. She spent some time learning a new job, and it was just Dad Boot Camp 101.
Hello.
But Quebec took that idea and expanded it, combining the parental leave with a province-wide inexpensive daycare program. The new federal budget doesn't do that, and so right away today came the complaints that the leave isn't near enough.
To actually move women to change their decision from staying out of the workforce to entering, you'd have to do something like the $1 billion plus daycare in Quebec.
Here you go. Maybe.
And here's something to keep in mind. The budget doesn't actually add new money for this. The changes will come from the $7.5 billion childcare windfall announced last fall. The new leave plan is expected to cost about $1.2 billion over 5 years. And since timing is always everything, it's really important to know the new benefits don't kick in until June of 2019, just in time for the next election. So here's a little bit of an oddity. Fathers in Japan and South Korea have the best benefits in the world. It's in the neighborhood of 12 months of paid leave at roughly 60% of their salaries, and yet only 2 to 3% are taking it because they seem to think all their peers will look down on them if they do. So some changes don't take all that quickly. Now, let's have a look at one of the commitments in the budget that doesn't have any money attached, but affects a lot of people. Andrew?
Yeah, you can say that again, Adrian. A national drug plan is being talked about yet again. An advisory group is going to look at ways to provide prescription drug coverage for all. But as Vicadopia tells us, this discussion is decades old, and this promise has been made before.
Money's so tight, Shelley Wiggum D'Angelo never eats out. Despite having 2 jobs, she has no drug plan. After food and rent, there wasn't enough left to pay for heart medication. Then last summer, she had a heart attack.
I was embarrassed. I didn't want to tell anybody that I couldn't afford them.
A recent survey found 1 in 5 Canadian households struggles to pay for prescription drugs.
What does it say about Canada and is about Canadians when we're putting our fellow citizens in these positions to make these awful choices?
This family doctor is encouraged the federal government seems serious about pharmacare.
We're announcing the actual advisory council, but a lot of work needs to be done.
The council's job won't be to decide if the public system should pay for prescription drugs, but rather how.
What it can't do is it can't rehash the question and ask once again, do we need to expand Medicare to include public drugs? Because we do.
It was first answered more than 50 years ago in the original blueprint for Medicare. In 1997, the Chrétien Liberals campaigned on bringing pharmacare into reality. But 6 months after getting elected, the health minister at the time threw cold water on the idea, saying it was unaffordable.
Sure, we can completely afford it.
This health economist says a national pharmacare plan might seem expensive. In Canada, $28 billion was spent on prescriptions in one recent year, but the experience of other countries shows a single drug buyer like the federal government can negotiate much lower prices for common medications, though some expensive drugs may not be covered in the public system.
There are some real advantages in terms of having better bargaining power as a national insurer.
Shelley Wigham D'Angelo now buys the same medication that might have kept her out of the hospital, saving her suffering and the system money. The uneven reality of Canadian healthcare. Vic Adopia, CBC News, Toronto.
So how does Canada stack up against other countries? Well, it is the only industrialized nation with a universal healthcare system that doesn't cover essential medications. And take a look at this. On average, New Zealanders spend the least on pharmaceuticals, just $23 per person per year, compared to $158 in Canada. It's a prime example of bulk buying. New Zealand can negotiate lower prices because it's buying drugs for the entire country.
Of course, there's plenty of other measures to talk about in this budget. Here are just a few more of them. The government announced today new money to fight the opioid crisis that has claimed thousands of lives across Canada. A $150 million emergency fund will be set up for provinces to launch treatment programs. Ottawa seems to be embracing the Me Too movement, setting aside $10 million to create a new unit within the RCMP to review sexual assault cases that were dropped by investigators as, quote, unfounded. And the country's national parks will now be permanently free for kids. This comes on the heels of Canada 150, and last year everyone could enter parks at no charge, and it was a huge success. And joining me now, the man of the hour, the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau. Nice to see you, Minister.
Happy to be here.
Let's start with one of the things that's not in the budget. There was a play to parental leave that we've talked a lot about. What there was not was anything for childcare. And you yourself in the budget say that access to quality childcare is a big concern. 1 in 4 families have access to regulated childcare. You know that. You know that getting women into the workforce requires better childcare. Why didn't you commit to more there?
I think this is important. You're absolutely right. But let's recognize that Canada is not a one-size-fits-all country. We put $7.5 billion over 11 years. And what you can see it in our budget, is provinces have chosen different approaches to approach childcare. There's different approaches everywhere. And what we're saying now is let's maintain an approach to dealing with gender issues through a multitude of approaches.
But you recognize that if you wanted more women back to work, to stay in the workforce, it requires somewhere to put children.
I do think that we have to recognize that that's not the only barrier, that the responsibility for childcare does fall disproportionately on women. When I had my kids, there was no opportunity for me to have a use it or leave it parental leave. That would have been a potential thing that I would have thought about. Now we have that option, which I think creates a possibility for women to be able to re-enter the workforce more rapidly, and for more equal sharing of childcare responsibilities that will have a big long-term impact on workforce participation for women.
Pharmacare, you've promised to implement something at some time. There's no money attached. The Liberals promised this in 1997. They found out how expensive it was. They walked away a year later. The PBO says that it'll cost $28 billion. or $20 billion, sorry. So where's the money? How do we know that you're actually going to do it this time? And are you looking at a price tag that high?
The problem is that there's a significant number of Canadians that don't get pharmacare through their workforce, or that aren't old enough that they get it through the government, or young enough in the case of Ontario where they get it through the government. So we're starting with that problem, recognizing that the solution may not be exactly the way the PBO gets to the overall cost. We already have most employees. I'm pretty sure you have pharmacare. I have pharmacare. The vast majority of people employed in full-time jobs have pharmacare.
So it'll be means-based?
Well, we're dealing with the people who don't have it, and we're trying to find a way to ensure that it's there. It's fundamentally important as part of healthcare to have pharmaceutical availability. That is complex. What was done 20 years ago, it's not the same as today. We have many more people that operate independently, that aren't working full-time. Sure. There's a different situation, and there's also different provincial plans out there. So it requires some analysis and study, but we're serious. We know that this is an issue, and we are going to get at the analysis to find a way to make sure that we can solve for this problem for the long term.
Last question. This was, as you had signaled, a gender budget, lots of things for women and for other groups in the population. But a lot of people see that then as a political document, that this is you getting ready for an election, sprinkling a little bit everywhere to make sure you have votes. What would you say to them?
Talking about gender means we recognize that more women can be in the workforce because they want to be, more women can get full-time jobs because they want them, and they need to have better outcomes at work, and that will be better for our economy because we'll actually deal with the very real demographic challenge at the same time as giving everyone what they should have, which was just equal opportunity to success.
Minister, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
If it wasn't budget day, you better believe this story would be dominating here on the Hill again. The Prime Minister's trip to India gone wrong. Still, there was no distracting from the government's major mistakes there.
Randeep Sarai, is he still your BC caucus chair, sir?
I'll be meeting with Randeep Sarai later today.
Randeep Sarai is the Liberal MP on the trip who invited Jaspal Atwal to a Canadian reception. Atwal has been convicted of attempted murder and is connected to Sikh extremists. Late tonight, the answer to the question you just saw Justin Trudeau being asked, Randeep Sarai is stepping down as the federal Liberals Pacific Caucus chair. As Katie Simpson tells us, that comes after Trudeau was hammered with angry questions today inside the House.
The Prime Minister has taken failure to a new level. In fact,
Andrew Scheer looked as if he could hardly wait to launch his attack. The Conservative leader questioned the government's explanation that rogue factions in India helped facilitate Jaspal Atwal's appearance at official events to embarrass Canada.
A senior security official made the allegation that the government of India is somehow complicit. Does the Prime Minister agree or disavow those allegations?
For the first time, the Prime Minister publicly backed the theory and defended the senior security official who shared the information with reporters on the condition of anonymity.
Our professional, nonpartisan public service does high-quality work, and when one of our top diplomats and security officials says something to Canadians, it's because they know it to be true.
Justin Trudeau's trip to India was sidelined by Atwal's presence. The BC man was convicted of attempted murder in an attack on an Indian cabinet minister in 1986. But the government's theory does not explain why Liberal MP Randeep Sarai invited Atwal to events in the first place.
Do you think Mr. Sarai should stay in caucus?
Well, this is not something that I can comment on.
Sarai met with Trudeau tonight and announced he would be stepping down from his role as the Liberals' Pacific Caucus chair.
People were there to welcome him.
Trudeau's visit and the fallout are certainly making for interesting talk in Canada's Indian community.
I'm not certain what his objectives were going on the trip to India.
This issue was highlighted.
At this Punjabi radio station, views are mixed over whether anything positive came out of the mission.
It looked like it may have boomeranged a bit because of some missteps. So what could have been just a frivolous trip is actually now he has some baggage that he's got to sort of deal with.
The honourable leader of the...
And as far as the opposition is concerned, they're not going to be letting any of that baggage go. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Ottawa.
Just getting started here on Parliament Hill tonight. I've basically moved in. Althea, Andrew, and Chantal all here with a special budget edition of At Issue.
And we're keeping a close eye on some of tonight's other big stories. Still, for example, no relief in Syria. The bombing continues in eastern Ghouta. And tonight, there's word women are being put in danger by the very people who are supposed to help them.
And a little later on The National, stop me if you've heard this one. It's about a stolen case of beer in Cape Breton and a Facebook post that goes a little something like this.
He's got a stupid effing haircut, if that helps.
Him and another young fella stole a 2-4 out of the bed of my truck while I was taking a piss in Tim's.
I was on my way out when I saw them jump into a green Pontiac Bonneville.
The struggle simply to survive has taken a grim turn for Syria's most vulnerable women. A new report says they are being exploited for sex, preyed upon by the very men they look to for humanitarian aid. Widows and young girls without family connections or male relatives are most at risk. According to aid workers, the abuse is an open secret, happening for years at a local level and being ignored. As Margaret Evans explains, stopping it will require a systemic overhaul.
The hopes of a besieged people disappearing in the smoke above what's left of eastern Ghouta. No civilians out, no aid in. Despite a Russian-ordered pause in the bombing campaign against the rebel-held enclave. Over almost before it began, just like the UN Security Council's call over the weekend for a 30-day truce across the country. Now, reports of yet another affront to Syria's suffering civilians.
They were withholding the aid that had been delivered and then using these women for sex.
Aid workers say they raised the alarm 3 years ago after speaking with Syrian refugee women in Jordan, who said local men hired by international agencies to distribute aid in Syria were using it to force women into sex. A fact-finding report by the UN Population Fund has backed up the allegations, saying examples were given of women or girls marrying officials for a short period of time for sexual services in order to receive meals.
The allegations that
a UN refugee agency spokesman said the previous allegations had been unsubstantiated, but that the UN had worked to ensure women receiving aid are protected.
But the mere suggestion that the UN can somehow control the situation in a war zone and the implied conclusion that we can somehow turn this on and off is rather simplistic.
Critics say that's not good enough, especially in the wake of recent scandals involving aid workers accused of sexual assault.
Then what you're essentially saying is that you can't guarantee that aid gets to the beneficiaries that you're targeting.
Some aid agencies say they have worked to reduce risk of abuse by not handing aid over to local councils for distribution. For the people of eastern Ghouta, though, there appears to be no relief in sight of any kind at all. Margaret Evans, CBC News, London.
Now let's head on back to Parliament Hill. Rosie's waiting.
Adrian, much more budget day analysis to come. A special ad issue, women, the big winners in this budget. So who stands to lose? We'll get into that next on The National.
Tonight on The National, another blow for Headley. One of their upcoming shows has been canceled. Caesars Windsor announced next month's show there is off, and other venues are being pressured to do the same. It comes just a couple of days after a woman came forward to CBC accusing lead singer Jacob Hogard of rape. Hogard denies the allegation, saying it was consensual. As for tonight's Headley show in Kingston, it's still on. There are reports out of the U.S. tonight that President Trump's son-in-law, who's also his senior advisor, has been stripped of his top-level security clearance. Sources told U.S. media that the decision was made after Jared Kushner failed to complete his FBI background checks. It means he no longer has access to top-secret intelligence briefings, including the presidential daily briefing.
No budget decision was taken without being informed by what we call gender budget and that gender-based analysis plus. Now, we firmly believe that this must not be a one-time event. It must be how all future budgets are made.
Finance Minister Bill Morneau earlier today, not the first person to make a budget based on gender analysis, but he's hoping to be the last finance minister not to. Supporting women was a huge theme in this budget, and there was a lot more to it than just gender. For all of that, we have at issue in the House with me here in Ottawa, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj, all here with me on Parliament Hill. Okay, I had a little preview into what these guys would say earlier this afternoon. They're not jumping for joy over the budget. What the big takeaway, Chantal?
Pre-election document, not much of a plan in there, hard to find the vision. You're right, of women's stuff. A colleague of mine in the French version counted 700 instances of women in the plural. That's a lot. But I think a lot of women will look at this and say, but where's the beef? Because for all of these references and a lot of these things are good initiatives, the beef would be a more affordable childcare program if you want to get women in the workforce, and it's not really there.
And you signaled that even last week, saying that was the key to showing that you meant it, really.
Well, for millennials who are now starting or having families, it's obviously the biggest budget item, plus affordable housing. So combine the two, and all this language about analysis is bound to fly right past a lot of people.
Is this not, though, Andrew, let's say we can look at it and pull a story thread out, and the story thread is growth through all different segments of the population. Is that a possibility, that the story they were trying to tell?
That they're trying to tell, yes, and there's some truth in it. Obviously, if you're not making maximum use of every section of your population, including in this case particularly women, then you're going to be, having less than optimal growth. That's true. But there's a lot of other things that go into growth, most of which was just basically ignored in this budget. So the equality part, they were very concerned about, the growth part less. And we're facing really quite severe challenges right now, both short-term with the tax reform bill in the United States and the sudden change in the competitive climate that's right, and that's a real thing. And long-term with the demographic challenge of the aging of the population and the implication of being we've got to make sustained long-term increases in productivity. And there's just very little address to that. It's not really a budget per se at all, really. It's more of a manifesto. It's more of a statement of liberal beliefs, every liberal belief that they've ever had or hope people have, think they have, and yeah, with the election very much in mind.
Or taken from the NDP, as it were.
Or stolen from the NDP and now made into liberal policies.
Althea, what was your sort of takeaway in terms of how they were framing it and whether there's something there?
Yeah, it's a political document. It's a political document where Minister Morneau highlights that the Liberals are more concerned about the NDP than anything else, Donald Trump included, or NAFTA. And so he's stealing some of the NDP's best ideas, pharmacare, practically really the only costed NDP idea, and also stealing stuff from their 2015 platform, the NDP, on pay equity legislation, even on making status of women, or giving it a larger mandate. In this case, they're making it a permanent department. Those are two promises from the NDP in 2015. So it's interesting that is where they are going, but they really have opened themselves up on the right. I mean, there is no tax cut. There is no talk of tax cuts. And often, when you hear those on the left say they want to find new ways to increase spending by finding revenues, they look at tax loopholes and tax evasion. The Liberals are doing that. They are not going after line-by-line waste.
But is there a right that they could go after anyway? I mean, are they wildly attracting from the right typically? Was there some flank that they could go after?
No, but they leave themselves open to future events, and I don't mean future events a decade from now. You take this budget and you read it the way it's framed, and it's a long book. It's not a short budget. And you would think that this event that the government has talked to us about, the American election, the Trumping, it's absent. It's as if it is non-existent in the government's thinking, that it changed nothing. I suspect it changed the agenda here, but you find no evidence of that, no evidence of the challenges that Andrew was talking about, or of the government looking to address them. They're mentioned in passing, as in, we're going to have a long winter.
Certainly, political job one for the Liberals is always to nail down the NDP.
Sure.
They've been successful also in the recent past, the Chrétien Martin years, with taking away that center-right vote by going after the deficit. They sort of feel like, I imagine, that they don't need to do that right now because the deficit right now is quiescent. The Liberals are running small deficits for the same reason that the Harper Conservatives ran small surpluses, purely for political symbolism. You know, $10 billion either way really doesn't matter. But, and the big but is, we're 10 years into a recovery. All these numbers are predicated on the fact that we're never going to have another recession again, or at least in the next couple of years. Yeah. And that's not at all clear. We've already seen rumblings in the interest rates of them starting to climb. So we're already into a slightly different world than we've known for the last few years. And again, there's not much sign of recognition of that here.
So, and that gives us a jumping off point for the deficit, because that is no longer a dirty word, and it's certainly not something that they seem interested in tackling at any point.
No, and in fact, some of the numbers around that math, I mean, Andrew kind of pointed to it, they are creative numbers. I mean, they have pushed off infrastructure spending in future years. They've miraculously booked $354 million from tax evaders. They have miraculously found $19 billion. Interestingly enough, there is $21 billion of savings. The numbers seem to interestingly line up. They don't actually tell us what they're cutting. So it's creative math, maybe, I'm not sure. No, deficits are, people seemed okay with deficits, yes. But you have to wonder, you know, Paul Martin, that they trotted out during the 2015 campaign to say, don't worry, we're going to be like the old right-of-center Liberals. I mean, what would he think about this? Because they have given that up completely.
You know, I may be old school. I came here in the 80s, and I have never heard the finance minister, so that would be Mulroney onward, that didn't care about balancing the books, at least paid lip service to caring, which isn't even the case. Yeah. I'm guessing the premise that guides a lot of this budget is the premise that the chickens that could come home to roost will do so after the next election in a year and a half, and not before that.
And that seems dangerous to play that, though.
And there's a certain amount of indirection involved. So on the one hand, they're running the deficits, we're rejecting austerity. I think they're maybe hoping their friends on the left don't notice that spending actually is supposed to level off now for the next several years. And here's a little fun fact for you. Average spending under the Harper years as a percentage of GDP, 13.7%. Average spending over the next 5 years under the we don't like austerity Liberals, 13.8%. So there's your big difference in spending.
So how do they use this then to sort of secure their narrative for the future? If this was about putting the squeeze on the NDP, not worrying about the Conservatives, I guess, how do they push that forward, that story? What are we going to see over the next?
Have you seen how many groups have come forward to say how great this budget was? I mean,
so they've done what they need to do.
University, well, politically, they probably rightly feel that they have.
Yes.
Whether that's what you expect from a government rather than an opposition party campaigning for victory is a different story.
It's classic liberal clientelism. They're sowing all these different groups across the country. They're creating new ones. Well, it's a coalition of the funded, you know, of all these groups who will take the money and then amplify the liberal message. They're nonpartisan, they're independent, but they're kind of on the same page.
And they're happy.
And
they're happy.
Well, it's a budget that speaks to their ambition, right? They like to spend, they like to pick winners and losers. This is a budget where the heavy hand of government is involved. And there will be lots of people on the right who are very uncomfortable with that. But the government is saying, well, we're not your government, so that's fine with us.
Only about a minute left. Does it save Bill Morneau? I mean, I don't know if he was out of trouble anyway, if we had moved past that, but does this secure that he gets to do a fourth budget and maybe after re-election, yet another one?
I'm assuming he gets to do a fourth budget. Today is the day when I decided that he was never going to fit the mold of the fiscal anchor of the government and the cabinet.
And that's okay.
Voters will decide that.
Yeah, he's perhaps saved his job by handing over the writing of the budget to the Status of Women Department. I mean, this is not a conventional finance minister's budget.
No.
So he himself is no longer particularly an asset to the government, but maybe they've decided he's not so much of a liability that they can leave him in place.
30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't know that he is not the finance minister they wanted. I think he had a rocky start because he was a political neophyte and he felt personally attacked. And I think he sort of learned his lessons and how to deal with the media. And today you saw a much more polished version of Bill Morneau. I think he's sticking around.
But in a storm, I'm not so sure.
Everything's
Storm,
different.
Justin Trudeau will take the questions.
Oh, that's exciting.
All right, we're just going to stay here and talk for another 20 minutes. Thank you all, appreciate it. Good news for all of you who love politics as much as we do. At Issue is also a podcast. You can get extra content and, of course, the main panel in podcast form every week. iTunes, any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/The National.
And still to come on The National, the tall tale of Terry from the Pier, how a theft became an urban legend, and why there just might be a bigger lesson to be learned here.
The story old as time. You put your beer in the truck, someone steals your beer. I mean, it's happened to all of us. Maybe some of us have even stolen some beer. I don't know, but it's a thing, you know, everybody can relate to.
Our Tom Murphy went looking for the thief, only to find a Canadian tall tale too good not to believe.
On the search for truth, a road trip to Cape Breton Island. A place known for its storytellers and, dare we say it, the odd fibber. It's true, things can be larger than life here. Have you heard this one? It comes from a recent Facebook posting by a Ronnie Talbot, apparently in a desperate tizzy.
Does anybody know a guy named Terry from the Pier?
He's got a stupid effing haircut, if that helps.
Him and another young fella stole a 2-4 out of the bed of my truck while I was taking a piss in Tim's.
I was on my way out when I saw them jump into a green Pontiac Bonneville.
The lady at Tim's said all she knows is he's a young fella named Terry.
He may tint car windows for cash.
Someone may know him from that.
A beer burglar, huh? A beverage bandit.
I think that it's a shame what happened to Ronnie. That's a sin.
Before long, the crime became the stuff of urban legend, the talk of the town. There were countless posts on social media.
He stole his beer. How would you feel about someone stealing Cape Bretoners beer?
A GoFundMe campaign to get Ronnie Talbot another 2-4 of Keith's. It raised close to $400.
Sounds good, buddy. Good take.
Yeah, we'll try that again, I guess.
And Brian Cathcart and Redmond McDougall of the band Pretty Archie even wrote a song about the by now famous Cape Breton Caper and Ronnie Talbot, who was so hard done by.
It's a story old as time. You put your beer in the truck, someone steals your beer. I mean, it's happened to all of us. Maybe some of us have even stolen some beer. I don't know, but it's a thing, you know, everybody can relate to.
Their impromptu music video soon took off.
Gather round on me, boys, and let me tell you this. I pulled into a Timmy's, got out to take a piss. The Bonneville's closing door was all that I could hear. I saw the stupid haircut. Terry stole my beer. Terry stole my beer. Terry stole the beer. He jumped into the Pontiac, took off out of here.
But get this, there is no evidence any of it is true. We went to the Tim's in the Pier, that's Whitney Pier.
Hey, did anybody see a guy named Ronnie Talbot come in here?
No recollection from any of the staff of a Ronnie Talbot ever coming in.
Anybody know Ronnie Talbot?
Although they all heard the story. Turns out the original post was a fake. We tracked down the author who sheepishly told us just that, but he wouldn't go on camera. Fact is, none of it was true, not a word. But here's the thing. Even after the mainstream media published stories explaining the tale was not true, according to Cara Mulrooney at the local pub, some people still think Terry stole the beer.
People want to believe it's true.
They do. It's crazy, but it's true. They do want to believe it's true.
Even though they know it's not true.
There's a lot of people that think it happened.
So what's up with that? From the scene of the crime, using social media, we reached out to Bryony Swire Thompson at Northeastern University in Boston. She studied this kind of thing and has a PhD in misinformation. It's a thing.
We're finding incredibly regularly is that even if people update their beliefs initially, it's over time that they start to re-believe in the inaccurate information.
This little beautiful.
When Donald Trump linked vaccines and autism, Swire Thompson showed 2,000 participants in her study those statements.
Now is autistic.
What's going on with autism?
Later, they agreed with evidence disputing such a claim. But Swire Thompson says testing those same people a week later.
This little beautiful child went to have the vaccine, now is autistic.
Showed that their belief in the misinformation had bounced back to nearly original levels.
So it just means that even if people are accept accept the retraction initially. It's over the long period of time, and I think that's the really scary thing, is that, over time you're going to forget that the correct information.
And she says retracting familiar information actually makes it more familiar and more likely to be believed.
Autism has become an epidemic.
Yes, it's true about Trump, just like it's true about Terry.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Yeah, so did Ronnie ever find his beer?
Okay, I know she's pulling my leg, but you get the idea.
I said, who stole my 2-4? She said, he's from the pier. I think he tints windows. He did my buddy's truck.
So help me Jesus, Terry, if I find you by your...
Once you get a story or a version of it in your head, even though it's been proven to be wrong, it sometimes never leaves you.
Now Ronnie's on the coffee boys, 'cause Terry stole the beer.
And so it is with this most Canadian of a tale, of a beer bandit at Tim's, and the hilarity that ensued.
Terry, do the right thing, give the beer back.
Tom Murphy, CBC News, Whitney Pier, Nova Scotia.
That's pretty good. At this point, though, you might be asking, what happened to all that GoFundMe money? Well, we were told the person behind the campaign has plans to donate it to the Whitney Pier Youth Club, but as of this afternoon, the club says it has not seen a dime.
This goes on and on. Listen, lots more to come tonight, but first, a special look at a phenomenally popular art installation opening up here in Toronto. This is tonight's Lens. This is one of 6 infinity rooms by Japanese artist Yayoi Kusama, featured at the Art Gallery of Ontario. She is 88 years old and doesn't use social media, but these mirrored rooms speak loud and clear to our selfie obsessions. Patrons can only spend 20 seconds in each room. That's just part of the experience, but you can take a longer look at other works from her legendary career. Follow us on Instagram to see more.
Hello, Dragons. Next time on Dragon's Den.
This was a turning point.
The star of Kim's Convenience.
What happened then after the den?
Takes you behind the scenes.
And Arlene was spot on. It changed our life.
A Dragon's Den special, Thursday at 8 on CBC. Presented by Canada Post. CBC, Canada's Paralympic Network.
Tonight on The National, a British Columbia family speaking out about a devastating house fire that they say was sparked by a faulty iPhone, and they want compensation.
Got to within about 2 meters of the house. The heat was just intense and I couldn't get any closer. I didn't really see much. Basically, all I could see is black smoke in the house.
The fire broke out at their farmhouse in Langley in 2016. The exact cause is still under investigation, but fire officials have said they found a charred iPhone in a chair where they believe the fire started. They also said the phone or the charger might have been the cause. So the family has reached out to Apple asking for $600,000 to help pay for their losses.
It really wasn't till probably again in February when the things started to catch up on us, when we started to think about this isn't fair, this isn't right that this happened to us and we're in this position through no fault of our own.
Now, Apple has confirmed it's looking into the family's claim. The family, meanwhile, has started a social media campaign. They say they hope it'll pressure the company to pay up. You're looking at the scene in Croatia today after parts of the country were hit by a weather system dubbed the Beast from the East. For days now, much of Europe has been crippled by a blast of Siberian air, and at least 7 deaths have been linked to the cold. Schools and airports across the continent have been affected, and it's not over yet. Forecasters say freezing temperatures will likely last until the end of the week, and parts of the UK are expected to have heavy snow in the days to come. And that's a wrap on another successful mission to the International Space Station. Just a couple of hours ago, 3 crew members returned to Earth after more than 5 months in space. The 2 Americans and 1 Russian landed in Kazakhstan in a Soyuz spacecraft. Their trip home took just over 3 hours.
The 90th Academy Awards are coming Sunday, and one of the films getting a lot of buzz is The Post. It's a true story, as you know, up for Best Picture, about the race to publish classified documents known as the Pentagon Papers. They were leaked to the press by this man, Daniel Ellsberg, back in 1971. They exposed the lies and the failures of the U.S. war in Vietnam. The leak was a massive embarrassment for the Nixon administration and earned Ellsberg the scorn of the president. I had the pleasure of spending a day with Daniel Ellsberg recently. Here's a glimpse.
Hello. Yes, Mr. President. I just say that we've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch. And just because some guy's going to be a martyr of allowing a fellow to get away with this kind of wholesale thievery, or otherwise it's going to happen all over the government.
He's signing his death warrant as a president. He's signing his impeachment warrant.
We've got to have a united front on Ellsberg. That's the main thing.
I haven't heard
that. Can work with him or not, sir? Will do.
What's it like to hear the president talk about you like that?
So when I hear that, I hear a president making the decision that is going to not only get me off trial, but I mean, the idea was he put me on trial, but making the decision by putting me on trial that actually led to his resignation, facing impeachment, and made the war endable.
He is an amazing man. We'll have a lot more of that conversation tomorrow night on The National.
Well, cassette tapes were, once upon a time, the cutting-edge technology for music. These days, not so much. So what happens when a group of grade 2 students comes face-to-face with these relics of the past and tries to figure them out? Well, that's our moment of the day.
Does anybody know what this is?
Something in the olden days that you would play like music with or something.
What are you looking for?
A place to put the plug in. I'm trying to find where this goes in. If you put it in something, the tape will start going and it'll like make music. It came out a bit more. Yeah, nothing's happening right at the moment. We could open it up and put it in. I don't know how to open it. It's like from like the olden days. I'm pretty sure my grandparents have one.
Okay, so this actually hurts, like it physically hurts. And I know we can laugh all we want, but we have to let them know tapes aren't dead, you know, aside from the mixed ones in my basement. But last year was actually a good year for cassette sales, 174,000 sold in the U.S., 35% increase from 2016. Not dead yet.
I was supposed to say here something about Guardians of the Galaxy and those mixtapes being the reason, but I feel because Ian's not here, we should say that Ian would probably remember something called an 8-track. Ouch. I don't know what that is.
We'll have to remind him of that one. I will admit, I don't get this whole resurgence, gosh, I mean, the vintage stuff. The fortunate thing is I don't have to get it, though. Cassette tapes still represent 0.1% of all album sales last year, 0.1%, so not making a comeback anytime soon.
Don't be like that. Listen, that is The National for February 27th. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.